Right now, we're going to go now talk about the 20th century for the first time in this course. Historians are convinced that the 19th century began in 1815 with the fall of Napoleon, and it takes about 100 years to really begin what we call the 20th century. That is the beginning of World War I and the world that it unleashes after that. You might find it odd, therefore, that if we're talking about a 20th century war, we're going to talk about 19th century causes. Basically, World War it just built up and up and up in terms of the tensions within Europe, to the point that everything that we've talked about before, particularly when it comes to all of those alliances that happened before the war, really start to have an effect. And it just takes one little pluck of a string, and all the strings go off, and you have World War One. And so World War One really creates the 20th century, even though it's 100 years ago from around today in 2017. It's really we really live in its shadows still in a lot of regards. So we're going to talk a lot about it in these videos. The first thing we need to do is we need to discuss some underlying facts with it. The first fact being that it begins in August of 1914 with Germany and Austria on one side. We call it the Central Powers, and France, Britain, Russia, and Serbia called the Allies. Now, other nations are going to enter. For example, in November of 1914, you have the Ottomans joining in on the Central Powers side, and on May 15th, you see Italy come in on the Ally side. And so on and so forth. Each alliance receives new allies. Perhaps the most important for the overall prosecution of the war is going to be the United States eventually in April of 1917. The war lasts until 1918, Armistice Day, 11/11, or November 11th. And today we call it, of course, Veterans Day, but back then they would have called it Armistice Day. The war is unlike anything it's ever been really ever happened. What makes it really unusual is a system of trenches. We have had trench warfare before this war, but nonetheless, by the time you get to the end of 1914, you have a trench system that has never been seen before in the history of mankind. For example, by the time we get to the end of the war, one could actually walk underground from the English Channel coast all the way to Switzerland. Excuse me. That's how far these trenches how far they span, and how developed and intricate they were, in terms of the fact that you could actually go underground for those 400 miles. Both sides basically dug in and just stayed. And the principal reason is the fact that the technology of warfare had just absolutely just made the defense of war a lot more powerful than the offensive war. And we see this with two different types of weaponry. Excuse me. You have, for example, machine guns, and you have artillery. Both are defensive weapons for the most part, and basically you set them up and you wait for some poor soldier to show up, and then just mow them over with your firepower. In the Second World War, we see these same weapons, but they're placed on offensive vehicles, airplanes, tanks, and vehicles, so that the offensive really comes back with a vengeance. But in World War I, tanks and airplanes, they're primitive, and so is artillery and machine guns. When it came to they were just the most effective, just sitting and waiting for someone to attack. So this is very much a defensive war. So you might be thinking, who's going to be nuts enough to go and try to just basically charge into these things? No one's going to be nuts enough, not first of all to order it, and second of all actually follow the order. Au contraire, generals don't know anything else but to charge these defenses. And as the war drags on and nothing seems to change, generals become increasingly eager to try to break up the stalemate that exists. So by the end of the war, we have mass slaughter on both sides. Let's talk about some statistics and some percentages. This is a rather interesting part. For example, France mobilizes 8.4 million men. 1.4 of those are killed. 4.8 are wounded or prisoners. What that basically means then, if you're in the French army, you had a 16.2% chance of dying, a 73% chance of becoming wounded or missing, or even dead. So basically 73% of the soldiers France put into the war are wounded, missing, or dead, or prisoners. Germany mobilizes 11 million, 1.8 are killed, and 16%, so 16% of those are mobilized are killed, with a further 5.3 wounded or missing. So 65% of the total men were actual casualties of this war. Austria's numbers are even worse. 7.8 million in uniform, 1.2 killed, or 15% of those mobilized, and 5.8 missing or wounded, meaning that 90% of the Austro-Hungarian armies were either killed, wounded, or missing. The United States, of course, had only 115,000 killed. Almost all of it in 1918, and it really, so you can see our contribution to this war is minimal. But we do have to remember that we lose anywhere between 58,000 and 65,000 in Vietnam. So this is not, this is more deadly than Vietnam was. 9 million people died on the battlefields of World War I, and so you can guess that the losses had a tremendous impact on things like politics, society, economics, and most important of all, the psychological well-being of civilization as a whole.